welcome back to Knowledge Resources Speaker Feature. Today, we're sitting down with Gita Maharaj, the Group Head of Culture Transformation at Absa Group Limited. Gita, thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Amy.
Gita, could you give us a quick overview? What do you think some of the benefits are of being purpose-driven, especially as we're trying to move towards more human-centered organization?
I think it's such a fundamental part of how we should be thinking about workplace culture and performance, because really as human beings, one of the key ways that we're wired is the search for meaning. I often talk about how if there's one thing that really unites people, regardless of company, industry, geographical location, it's that people in the world of work are really looking to experience dignity and meaning. And so this search for meaning really comes through when you've got a clear idea of why are we here? What brings us together? What really unites us in terms of the collective action that we're coming together and organizing around? So in terms of people unlocking discretionary energy and feeding this very human need, deep need for meaning, it's really clear to us that if we want to get the best out of people and also give them a great experience, that anchoring the journey and providing clarity around how they contribute to the purpose of the organization is a really central piece of it. And I think what we're also finding with younger generations, and there's a lot of research around millennials and mature millennials, and even the younger generations coming into the workplace, I think that's even heightened from previous generations. People want to come into the workplace with a bigger sense of personal purpose. And so I think it's also makes sense that for us as organizations, we need to step up and be able to articulate what's our reason for being. Why are we here? And why does it make sense for all of us to join together around this common objective? So for us, that's a non-negotiable, so to speak. Everything we do is rooted in our purpose as an organization. And what we find is that the emotional connection that unlocks is really so powerful in terms of the relationships between individuals and the quality of contribution that people can bring.
And it's interesting as well, Gita, there's been a lot of industry conversations about how purpose links to employee values, company values. And I'm interested to ask you this specifically because I know you've worked with some startups and helped them build from the ground up. How intentional do you think companies need to be about their values from the get-go? Or is values and purpose and sort of the interconnectivity of it all something that has to develop organically as we go along?
That's a great question, Amy. My own view on this is that we've typically tended in corporate environments to look at the issue of values in a way that's not been very helpful. We've been looking at setting out company values and then going through a process of alignment and checking, what's the gap between where my personal values are and the company values and how to close that gap. And that whole process is really quite far removed from how values actually show up in our lives. And what I mean by that is that values tend to be almost universally understood and accepted. I've not been in any conversations in my entire career where people argued whether key values were actually values. So no one argues about whether respect is a value or integrity is a value. But where I found the work needs to be done and where I believe the purposeful aspect of organizational process needs to happen is how do we set ourselves up in the organization to have meaningful conversations about what the values mean for us? So if respect is a value that's important to me, respect is a value that's important to you, you're my line manager, how does respect show up for you? I'm your direct report. How does it show up for me? I'll use a really brief example. For me, perhaps respect shows up that I would like to be greeted when I see my colleagues every day. I'd like to be acknowledged and in that sense, really connected at a human level, I'd like to be seen. Whereas perhaps for you as my line manager, respect is about delivering work on time, every time. Now, the key issue around cultural cohesion and developing shared meaning, and that's what culture is. It's this process of developing shared meaning, the ability and opportunity to have meaningful conversation about how we interpret this word called respect becomes the critical thing. So in terms of the work I've done with startups, I would say, it really does need to be a very intentional journey, but intentional around building organizational capability to have conversation about these universally held values or personal values, or whether we want to ascribe and say these are company values that are strategically really important. The conversation about what it means to us, how it translates, and how it shows up is actually a really vital piece in the whole process.
There's so many great things to touch on there, Gita, because especially now in the HR Summit, we'll be taking a lot of looks at how we can take paper-based policies and translate them into the culture of organization. So having those conversations, like you mentioned, is absolutely imperative for having that translate into the actual culture of the organization. And so many of the other insights you mentioned are things that I would love to touch on more and talk on more. But I think for the interest of the interview and to build on what you said about startups, I'd like to combine two questions for you. So it's a little bit twofold. The first one is, considering the metrics that we can use to measure culture, are there any that stand out to you as particularly useful? And considering your experience in startups and seed funding, do you ever foresee a future where measurable culture could be considered an asset that could actually be placed in front of investors and say, this is why we're great, this is why you should invest in us?
Oh, thanks for that, Amy. Those are really great, challenging questions. The issue of metrics and measuring culture has been a fascinating area for me, because one of the things we notice with anything that has to do with measurement, that it provokes behavior that sometimes is counter to the type of cultural change you're trying to bring about in the organization. So we've done a lot of research into what happens when you put a measure into play into an organizational system. And we've been going through a process at Absa over the last 24 months where we've developed a new measure around the colleague experience and the culture, and we've embedded it in the balanced scorecard. And one of the things that we've been paying attention to is, well, what type of behavior does this drive? And is this behavior actually desirable and in keeping with our cultural intent and the outcomes we're looking for? And one of the key things in my experience that I've observed about metrics and culture metrics is that in a corporate context, a lot of the IP around culture measurement has come from external service providers. And there's some very well-known global brands that do amazing work in terms of the thinking and the constructs that they're using. But the challenge when you sit within an organization, and I've always worked within organizational contexts and looked at how do we get traction on some of these large-scale system changes, is that a key obstacle and challenge was that in the organization, the measure itself was a black box. Management and leadership didn't understand how this measure was derived. What does this measure consist of? And also, therefore, by implication, what are the levers we use to start shifting this measure? And so I would say that depending on the journey an organization is on, to think very carefully about whether they want to use external benchmarks and measures, or whether they actually want to develop metrics that are strategically aligned to the journey that they are on. We've taken the latter route in my organization, and it's proving to be an enormous success. The type of traction we're getting with leadership and management and the levels of ownership around the journey are extremely high. And we've had unprecedented levels of employee engagement and participation in our annual survey, which amounted to 80% of colleagues last year. So that was close to 28,000 people who participated in our survey last year. So what I'm saying is the cultural element to using metrics in an organization also needs to take into account how are people going to receive this information? To what extent do they feel prepared to take ownership of this measure? And then therefore, are we set up to help them with the understanding, the knowledge, and the ability, particularly at a management level, to do something about the experience that this metric is measuring? So it's early but exciting days for us in our organization. And I think it's bearing fruit for us to say that we need to back ourselves on our journey. So I'm a real supporter of companies coming up with strategically aligned measures that make sense in their environment for their unique journey.
Well, many congratulations on that, Gita. That's no easy feat, 28,000 people for a survey. And getting that engagement and having people really care is an absolutely amazing thing. We have a wonderful author for KL called Tracy Swanepoel, who recently said it's almost like a sport team. It's people being fans of a sport team and really engaging with, they know the players, they know the game, they really care about the game. So it's an interesting correlation that between people really caring about it. You also mentioned the black box and how it's important for managers to really understand what they're looking at. This is a metric for culture. And that brings me nicely, I think, to our second question, which was, do you think culture would ever be a tangible or an intangible asset for investors to be able to look at? And almost in a way is, do you think culture will ever be an understandable thing for them to see and understand and know that it's an asset? Or do you think it's something that in the organization, we as a team know it's an asset, but it doesn't really translate to the external investor environment?
So it's an interesting question about whether culture could be used almost as part of the valuation, of a company. And I think historically we've seen that, when private equity and venture capitalists go and they look at prospects for investment, they do pay attention to what's the culture in the organization. And that's part of a discussion. And I think it definitely influences decisions, investment decisions, currently as a practice. But I think that there's a potential risk to say, do we want to almost start using it as part of a valuation base, because it starts speaking then to the financialization of human dynamics. And just as I spoke about some of the negative unintended consequences of putting measures in a scorecard, the financialization of culture could also produce negative unintended consequences. So I would tread very carefully with that. And I think nonetheless would, really encourage companies to become very aware of what are their key cultural attributes that they want to continue investing in, and to develop a very cohesive, coherent narrative around that. Not only that makes sense to investment or external customers, but that's really seamless and aligned with the experience inside the startup or the company. So still, I think there's a lot of merit in building that story of origin and being able to shape that and invest in it over a period of time. What I've found in a startup environment is that the cultures tend to cohere quite quickly, very early on, because the culture coalesces around a founder CEO. And there are still some companies, let's say in South Africa, 20-year-old companies that are still being run by founder CEOs. And you can see that it's helped create quite a cohesive, consistent kind of idea of what the culture is in that organization. But we also know that when in the journey of a company, the founder is no longer the CEO, that it starts having an impact on culture, and you start getting competing views and competing interests and ways of making meaning, etc. So again, an investment in a story of origin, what's our narrative in terms of the culture that we value and that we want to continue to invest in, can become a really important compass over a long period of time for a company's growth.
Well, we've spoken about a lot of very interesting topics today about investment and startup and culture and the values. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Amy.